Welcome to our June NCCEH Environmental Health webinar. Today's webinar is about climate health adaptation planning, titled Two Approaches, One Shared Journey, One Shared Learning Journey. My name is Anna, and I'm a knowledge translation scientist at the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. And again, for those of you joining later, please make sure this webinar is being recorded. Please make sure your cameras are off and your audio as well. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and we will keep track of them for the Q&A session after the presentation. And we'd also like to acknowledge the land on which we're calling from within the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, which include Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to live here, learn and work and play in this territory. And today we have the great pleasure of having Carrie Ann, Charles Norris, and Sarah Warren to talk to us about their climate change adaptation project that they're working on in Ontario. Carrie Ann Charles Norris is a member of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation and the Environmental Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services. She's been involved in climate change adaptation planning since 2011. And that includes assisting Indigenous communities in assessing, prioritizing, and developing health-specific adaptation and implementation plans that reflect the community's perspectives and their needs and priorities. And the work is founded on traditional ecological knowledge. And she's participated in numerous conferences, including the keynote for Queen's University 19th Annual Health and Human Rights Conference in 2019, as well as in Mexico, and giving presentations in the US, and in giving her Indigenous perspectives on environmental issues. And Sarah Warren is a climate change project associate at Simcoe Muskoka Health District, the health unit there, in Ontario. And Sarah earned her Master's of Public Health in Social and Behavioral Sciences from the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And she's passionate about improving population health and well-being, and she has a particular interest in addressing environmental health topics, including climate change, with applying health promotion and an intersectional lens. And in her position with Simcoe Muskoka Health Unit, and as a policy analyst with the Public Health Agency of Canada, Sarah has led the work on the scoping review project. So I'll go over to you, Carrie Ann and Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here today to have this opportunity to share two knowledge synthesis projects that were done in collaboration between Public Health Agency of Canada, Ontario Region, Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit, and Cambium Indigenous Professional Services, which combined aim to support local climate health adaptation planning in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities alike, and to advance public health practice and research. So we know that climate change is and will continue to have public health implications, and that public health not only has a duty to respond, but is also really well suited to address climate change. And in Ontario, like many other places across Canada, climate health adaptation is really in the early stages, and public health authorities are progressively working to address health impacts of climate change. So we're conducting vulnerability and adaptation assessments, and the next step is to engage in adaptation planning. And this can be very overwhelming of where to start, and that was really the inspiration behind these bodies of work. So today, I will present on our module 1, which is a scoping review, and then Carrie Ann will present on knowledge synthesis of Indigenous lens that are essential to incorporate into adaptation planning by public health. So we'll begin with the scoping review, which aims to highlight the range and characteristics and gaps in literature available on public health interventions for climate change adaptation applicable to 6 climate-sensitive categories that are identified on the screen. And today we'll be sharing some key findings and how they're applicable to public health practice and how they can drive future research activities. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that the data visuals that will be represented in this portion of the presentation were developed by Ainsley Butler, who is an epidemiologist at our health unit and is also a co-author on the module 1. So first we did analysis of time trends of the collected data, and this really shows us that in recent years, climate health adaptation interventions applicable to the 6 climate sensitive categories are increasingly implemented and published. And we look at the time trends by climate sensitive category, and we see that the climate sensitive categories have evolved over time between 2014 and 2019. And these changes really reflect the occurrence and awareness of climate-related events, health risks, and growing understanding of the climate connections. So an example of this is in 2017, which is represented by the yellow bars. The most common climate sensitive category addressed in the literature we captured was extreme temperature. And this reflects the global context because in 2016, this was the hottest year on record prior to 2020, of course, and it actually extended into 2017. Similarly, vector-borne disease is a climate-sensitive category that has increased over time or was captured more often over time in our review. And this really reflects the growing understanding that vector-borne diseases such as Lyme disease are connected to climate change and are becoming greater risks in our region. And so this really indicates that interventions are likely designed and published when these climate-sensitive categories and associated risks are more recognized. And while this is unsurprising, it also suggests that we are more reactive to rather than going in preparation for these climate-related events. And it really reinforces the importance of using that climate health lens when we're addressing related risks and also continually increasing our understanding of climate change health outcomes. We've also looked at time trends by intervention type. I'm just going to make sure my screen is right. There we go. And so these have also evolved over time. And so all intervention types, except for health promotion, were included in a higher number of articles in 2019 than in 2014. Health communication and environmental adaptation interventions experienced the greatest increase in the number of publications in which they were captured in 2014 and in 2019 compared to 2014. We also looked at geographic distribution of captured articles, and within the scope of our review, we included articles or interventions from North America, South America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And so this is the distribution of the captured articles, and you can see that most of them were derived from North America, and more than half of which were from Canada. And this was followed by Europe and the more granular geographic area was the UK. And so we also found variation in the distribution of particular climate sensitive categories and intervention types by geographic location. So some regions implemented specific interventions more often than others. So for example, most of the policy interventions that we captured came from Europe, and noticeably one of the least common intervention types captured from North America was policy interventions. Climate-sensitive categories addressed by region really reflect different regions' experience managing associated risks. So most of the interventions that we captured that addressed ultraviolet radiation came from Australia, which seems very logical because they have a lot of experience with that health risk. We also looked at various characteristics of captured literature, starting with the distribution of intervention types and climate-sensitive categories. So here you can see the distribution of intervention types. And this gives us insights into the types of interventions that exist and potential gaps. So on this screen, you can see the distribution by the main climate sensitive categories, which are identified on the right. And then more specifically, we broke it down into more narrow climate sensitive categories on the left. And this provides greater insight into what is being addressed. So for example, we can see that we collected 34 articles that address extreme temperature, 82% of which were addressing extreme heat and 12% of which were addressing extreme cold. And we also see that the most frequently addressed climate sensitive categories have higher levels of awareness of how they're of climate health risks, and also that awareness is often influenced by the frequency of those events and the severity of those outcomes. We've also identified interventions that are commonly used to address different climate sensitive categories. And there's some general findings. So some interventions more equally addressed different climate sensitive categories, such as health communication and health promotion. And then there's some interventions like surveillance and alerts or warnings that most commonly addressed one or two different climate sensitive categories. We also did a more granular look at this for intervention types by specific climate sensitive category, and then also climate sensitive category by intervention type. And all of this is highlighted with graphics and data charts in our more detailed reports, but I will highlight one example. So vector-borne diseases were particularly interested because articles that addressed vector-borne disease, surveillance was the most commonly applied intervention and health promotion was further down on the list. But if we looked at articles that applied health promotion, vector-borne disease was the most frequently addressed climate-sensitive category. And then comparing this with external literature, which states that really health protective behaviors are a very good way to prevent vector-borne diseases such as Lyme disease, this really reinforces that health promotion is a promising intervention and that either we need to explore it in more detail or potentially that climate health lens or that publishing of these experiences is not happening. Moreover, so we also captured a few interventions that we classified under other that were addressing vector-borne disease. And these were often very innovative or unique strategies, such as citizen science. So those were very interesting to explore. There's also interventions that were able to address more than one climate sensitive category at one time. And so this image shows lines that would connect the different climate sensitive categories being addressed at the same time. And the thickness of the line reflect how many articles captured this. And the intervention types most commonly able to address more than one climate sensitive category at one time were environmental adaptation interventions, such as the integration of green space, and then planning or decision making. And these tended to highlight how and when to implement other interventions to achieve an overall goal. So now I'm going to do a really high-level summary of the applicability of these results. And all of this is explicitly stated again in our detailed report in more or less the same headings that we have here. So I've alluded to these, but this is how we can apply these findings right away to climate health adaptation planning. So the geographic distribution can really help us source relevant examples. We can learn and build from experiences from other regions facing similar climate health risks. So I'll go back to the vector-borne disease example. The northeastern United States have more experience than Ontario addressing Lyme disease. And so we can learn from their experiences. Characteristics of existing climate health interventions can really help us build an inventory of possible interventions, which can be helpful in that vulnerability and adaptation assessment portion and the beginnings of adaptation planning. Interventions that address multiple climate-sensitive categories can help to distinguish interventions that may provide a greater return on investment and really help us prioritize interventions when we have limited resources. And then lastly, the interpretations of results just provide some key considerations that can be applied to our adaptation planning, but I won't go into much more detail on that now. And so our research has highlighted some potential gaps in knowledge and practice. So some intervention types may be underutilized, such as policy or guidelines and frameworks. Some climate sensitive categories may warrant greater attention, like ultraviolet radiation, and then some of those more lower level risks like blue-green algae, foodborne diseases, winter storms, and extreme cold. They were much less frequently captured, but they are increasing public health risks. And what's related to this is that we need to strengthen that climate health lens, as it might not be explicitly identified, or we might not have these interventions published on. And we made this interpretation because really common public health topics like air pollution and ultraviolet radiation, which are related to climate change, were not as frequently captured. Similarly, health promotion is really a core public health function, but it was one of the less frequently identified intervention types. Mental health outcomes are also insufficiently addressed. We didn't capture many of these articles, and those that we did, it was an add-on. It wasn't the focus of the entire article. And this aligns with external literature as well. And then lastly, we need stronger efforts to include Indigenous voices. And this is an example of it, because we only found one article that captured Indigenous lens. And this was flagged through our collaboration with our Knowledge Translation Advisory Committee and through reflection. And in this process, we identified that this was because the design of the scoping review did not explicitly aim to capture adaptation interventions specific to Indigenous people. And therefore, the search terms that we used in our scoping review did not include language reflective of Indigenous perspectives, and therefore, we didn't capture what is out there. And of the one article that we did capture, it highlighted multiple intervention types and multiple climate sensitive categories. But some of the interventions we weren't able to fit into the definitions of the intervention categories we had structured. We captured them under other, but this really illustrates that applying Western perspectives predominant in public health will not capture Indigenous contexts in a holistic way, or represent them appropriately. So this does not mean it's a gap in climate health adaptation interventions that take into account Indigenous contexts and perspectives. Actually, Indigenous peoples and communities are at the forefront of climate action, and you can find this quite easily. But it reflects a probable disparity in the meaningful efforts of including Indigenous voices. And this is an example of that unacceptable but common mistake, in that Indigenous voices were unintentionally excluded because the review did not purposely make space for an Indigenous lens from the beginning. So in an attempt to capture Indigenous perspectives and to support future public health efforts, a complementary project was conducted by Cambium Indigenous Professional Services to really capture critical concepts and Indigenous perspectives and knowledge that need to be understood and meaningfully integrated. And Carrie-Anne will share all that fantastic information very shortly. So what can we do now to advance practice and knowledge? So we need that knowledge translation activities, as I've touched on. We recognize that local public health authorities often don't have the resources to engage in this work, but other public health authorities can really support knowledge translation and provide required resources or share required resources. And a great example of that is today's webinar that's being hosted and facilitated by NCCEH. They've provided us with the platform to be able to share with a wider audience that we may not have had the opportunity to elsewise. We need to explicitly integrate that climate health lens. We want to really invest in these adaptation interventions because we know there's co-benefits for health and economic and the environment and everything else that we know so strongly. We want to really continue to build an understanding of those health risks. In doing so, we're more likely to be able to develop those interventions. Also, we need to focus on our gaps, such as climate mental health outcomes and integrating that Indigenous values, ways of knowing in assessments of climate health risks in order to strengthen adaptive capacities. And then public health authorities have a more responsibility to become educated on how to support Indigenous climate health adaptation. And this is an ongoing process, and I don't think it will ever end, and it shouldn't. So this work really helps to build an evidentiary basis to better understand climate health adaptation interventions, but it is just a start. And so to further advance this body of work and to go beyond the scope of this project, we highlight recommendations for future research. So it would be fantastic to capture intervention implementation bodies to see the cross-sectoral work that needs to happen, or to capture that, sorry. It would be great to identify specific health outcomes being targeted as opposed to the climate sensitive categories of this review. It would be great to identify explicitly what populations are being targeted, how health equity is or is not being accounted for. Capture characteristics for barriers and facilitators of adaptation interventions. How can we capture capacity building strategies for our organizations and teams, and then exclusively capture range and characteristics of adaptation strategies that are being applied by Indigenous communities. And then lastly is to continue to build the evidence and recognizing that this evidence should be a combination of both Western and Indigenous sciences or ways of knowing. And with that, I'll leave it to Carrie Ann to continue and share more about the missing piece.
I'm just going to switch over here and share my screen. So good afternoon, everybody. Anin Bojo, Carrie Ann Charles Dishnakaz, Georgina Island Dunjiba, Mayingan Dodam, Anishinabekwe and Dow Bindigan. So as introduced, my name is Carrie Ann Charles. I'm from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation here in Ontario. And I am a proud Anishinaabe woman, and I'm pleased to be here to present this work that Sarah and I have collaborated on today. So with that, I will begin. So I want to start by setting a bit of a context in regards to the Indigenous relationships with Mother Earth, so that you can get a better understanding as to the intimate connection that climate change is having and will continue to have on the health of our peoples and our well-being. I also want to demonstrate the urgency in which this gap needs to be rectified, and I hope that you start to think a little differently as you continue to provide the much needed services to all now into the future. So with this slide, you can see here is a snapshot of what I'll be speaking about to you this afternoon. It's a bit of a timeline to help you understand and see the connections between the effects of climate change and the importance of ensuring that the first peoples of this land are being meaningfully sought, listened to, and most importantly, incorporated into the plans for our collective future. So for many, land means property, the water, the air, and all that live within these ecosystems. But for the Indigenous peoples, land means more than property and even ecosystems. It encompasses our traditions, our culture, our relationships, our social systems, our spirituality, our values, responsibility, and law. The law that I speak about is what we refer to as the creator's law or the natural law, and is understood as all things are regarded as beings, plants, trees, animals, the insects, the rocks, and the unforeseen forces of nature are all considered beings. So those four elements of earth, water, fire, and air are all considered beings. And for us, the Indigenous peoples, the regard for life is one that recognizes the value of all life, of all those beings. We are all related to one another as we all have the same mother. Thus, we are all responsible for maintaining good and harmonious relationships for our next 7 generations. Indigenous peoples followed this law for millennia, and the outcomes and effects were abundant, thriving biological diversity that was balanced and sustainable. The seven grandfather teachings encompass the morals, values, structures, ceremonial practices, and spiritual beliefs of the Anishinaabe people. That's who I am. I'm part of the Indigenous peoples, but specifically I'm Anishinaabe people. These teachings also ensured the survival of the people and is a reflection of what we all should be striving for in life. If you strive to live your life following these simple principles, these 7 simple principles, Minot-B'Modzamin, which is a good life in Anishinaabemowin, is attainable. Many Indigenous communities around the world have teachings such as this that have guided their existence for millennia. Traditional ecological knowledge, also known as TEK or traditional knowledge, is a term that is widely used by many Indigenous communities, and it encompasses different ways of knowing, which are culturally based, place-specific, collective, holistic, and also includes long periods of observation. This differs from Western science because within Western science, there is a time-limited observation process. Science usually requires a quantitative validation, and it is often believed and considered valence once written down into textbooks, whereas the oral tradition is knowledge that is embedded with Indigenous ways of knowing. Living by the Creator's Law and the 7 grandfather teachings helps to inform TEK, which is mentioned is culturally based, place-specific, collective, holistic, and includes long periods of observation. The inclusion of TEK is key in climate change decision-making for our future, as it takes a holistic approach that is necessary. The 7 generations principle is an ancient Iroquois philosophy which reflects that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. This philosophy takes into the consideration that the land we walk upon today is not ours, but is being borrowed from those who have yet to be born. This is how you can visualize the 7 generations. I often get asked this question, what is 7 generations? So Henry Lickers, who is a Mohawk elder, and who has been blazing the trail for people like myself to work in this field of communicating the importance of including the Indigenous voices, was the one explained it to me this way. This, you can sort of put yourself in what the 7 generations look like. It's your grandmother, it's your great-grandmother, your grandmother, your mother, you, your grandchildren, your child, your grandchild, and your great-grandchildren. So there's 7 generations there, and that's what we should be looking at in making all of these decisions now and into our future. When you take all of these elements and apply them every day to everyday decisions, the outcomes are abundant, thriving biological diversity that is balanced and sustainable. So that was a little bit of a history around pre-contact. So I'll get into a little bit about contact and the effects of contact on the peoples and the environment, and as we talk about climate change and health moving forward into our future. Upon contact, there were many things that drastically changed for the Indigenous peoples. We no longer had the freedom to become connected to the land, provide for our families, practice our culture, or speak our language, and that was made law in 1876 through what is known as the Indian Act. This act was implemented for the sole purpose of getting rid of the Indian problem, and very much still has a major impact on the lives of the Indigenous peoples today. Just as Sarah had referenced geography trends as being important in regards to those interventions, I too will reference geography. Because as a part of colonization, the Indigenous peoples were separated from our territories and forced to live on small portions of land that are often in areas the government deemed unproductive or not important to the government. This disconnected us from the animals that were hunted, the plants that were harvested, the medicines that were gathered for both survival as well as traditional and cultural uses. This caused detrimental health effects like diabetes and heart disease, as we are forced to eat foods that are foreign. We are malnutritioned because the access to our natural food sources are no longer available. And these have caused detrimental impacts to our communities and people. The areas in which the peoples were placed are also areas in which industry has established and heavily polluted the environment, having adverse health effects on the people, which is being exacerbated now by climate change. These actions have also caused other illnesses, such as depression and addiction, because of the disconnect felt and the anguish of seeing the environment get depleted, not being able to uphold our responsibility to protect and take care of Mother Earth, which in turn ensures balance is maintained for future generations. This disconnect has now led to an unstable climate. Indigenous peoples were also forced to go to Indian hospitals, and the children ripped out of community and placed in residential schools far from home, tearing families apart, also causing illnesses such as depression and addictions, and worse, creating a gap in the translation of traditional ecological knowledge from one generation to the next. The effects of these actions we can see very prevalent in today's in community today, from the health and well-being of our Indigenous communities and the environment as a whole. The map you see here is a map of Ontario, which is all Indigenous land. The red spaces that you see are the reserve lands that the Indigenous peoples are forced to reside, and this is where we live today. So why is this important in climate change and health perspectives? So I'm going to sort of give you a little bit of going into the future. So this information is important because we talk about climate change and health interventions for now and into the future. Like Sarah has, the exclusion, like Sarah has talked about, the exclusion, although, as well as the inclusion of the Indigenous voice are equally important to know. Indigenous people have been making their voices heard at a rate unlike any in history. This graph depicts those voices and some of the many strides made. What all of these wins have in common is the fight for the right to health and well-being and the protection and preservation of the environment, which directly links to those rights and health interventions that are being developed. Indigenous people in Canada have went from not being considered humans to having legal rights and legislation that backs those rights. Through perseverance and resilience, the Indigenous voices and actions to fight for the right to health and well-being and to be able to fill the responsibility to protect and preserve Mother Earth are starting to be heard and understood. The wisdom that our knowledge holds and the importance of understanding the interconnectedness of Mother Earth are imperative as we move forward, especially when we're talking climate change. When doing so especially when doing so for the Indigenous peoples. Legislation and policy, such as the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, which include 7 specific calls to action for the health field, need to be leveraged. We have a lot to share about the interconnectedness of all beings and what needs to be done to adapt and mitigate the effects of our changing climate that can not just benefit the Indigenous peoples, but benefit all as a whole. An example of this, and Sarah actually talked a little bit about vector-borne diseases as well, is that through our knowledge and ways of knowing, there are medicines gifted by the land that we use holistically. And we use this holistically in looking at mind, body, and spirit, mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual of all areas of life that are being affected by the changing climate. Some of the work that I've been privileged to be involved in and I seen a question within the chat about the climate change health adaptation program that is occurring. I've actually been very privileged to be able to work with communities specifically under that funding. And having an intimate connection with Mother Earth, the Indigenous communities all over Canada through programs such as CHAP are proactively harnessing our knowledge to come up with solutions to address the climate change health vulnerabilities being identified within our own communities. And we're ensuring that our ways of knowing are embedded into those solutions. We are asserting our responsibility to take care of Mother Earth, who will in turn take care of us. And as I said, I've been privileged to work with several communities in regards to climate change as a whole, but more intimately with the 4 communities in regards to actually developing health specific adaptation plans over the last couple of years that really look to be specifically for community. And you can see that the interventions that we are planning here and the adaptation plans that are prevalent and upfront in communities are very much the same as what Sarah has outlined in her work. You can also see that the areas of priority, again, as I said, are the same as Sarah's, and both the Western science as well as the Indigenous lens are being taken into consideration in our communities as we develop these plans, as we know that both are important in being able to come up with the best plans moving forward. So going back to the difference between Western science and TEK, TEK is observations over time, and there are many things that we can learn from that. An example of this is the vector-borne disease, where I've identified through the TEK that there are plants and practices that are natural mitigation to the vector carriers, which then in turn, if we protect those natural plants, Mother Nature will in turn protect us from those natural vectors that carry those diseases. As the climate rapidly changes, and as we try to prepare for what is coming, we must start to ensure that all voices are being heard. The term Twoeyed Seeing, created by a Mi'kmaq elder named Albert Marshall, is becoming more prevalent and being used to guide and undertake work such as this. And it is learning from one eye with the strengths of the Indigenous ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of the Western knowledge and ways of knowing, while learning to use both of these eyes together for the benefit of all. Ethical space is another term that is becoming more common as we work towards adapting and mitigating climate change and response to environmental crisis. And as simply put, as respecting the views of others and ensuring a cooperative spirit between Indigenous peoples and Western institutions. These terms are important to know because they do not only hold value in the environmental field, but much like the 7 grandfather teachings can be applied in any context when the intent is to achieve a good, mutually beneficial and reciprocal outcome. If we are going to work together, we need to understand each other. The Indigenous people's philosophies are simple, easy to understand, easy to communicate, as well as pretty easy to apply. There are some best practices or wise practices as being termed in community that need to be considered as non-Indigenous peoples embark on creating space, inclusion, and relationship building with Indigenous peoples. And they include trust, which is the foundation of meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples. Research, which is necessary to have an understanding of the community that public health organizations or authorities want to engage. Respect, which is vital to ensure that the trust will be earned from those communities. Recognition that the rights of the Indigenous peoples and its representation in legislation is there. We have legislation that backs our rights. We are not stakeholders, we are rights holders. Remember that colonialism has had an impact and it will take time for those impacts to be rectified. It's taken generations for the impacts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide to get us to the point where we are today. So it's going to take generations for us to get out of those. And the responsibility It is on the public health professionals to ensure that they are educated so that they can appropriately and adequately provide climate change adaptation health services to the Indigenous peoples. With that, I do have some take-home messages, and these are imperative messages. It is imperative to know the history of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, to understand the present situation and make impactful, meaningful decisions for the future. It's imperative to include traditional ecological knowledge into decisions and plans for the future in a meaningful way. It is imperative that the legislation, as well as the programs that have been established, be leveraged to move the inclusion of Indigenous voices forward, and that the concepts such as Twoeyed Seeing are being implemented when doing so. And it is imperative, as already mentioned, that the public health practitioners take on the responsibility to ensure that they are educated on the history and the culture of the Indigenous peoples so that they can provide climate change adaptation health services appropriately and adequately now into the future. I believe that continued meaningful inclusion of Indigenous voices and perspectives at forums such as this, as well at government tables where policy is being developed and decisions about the environment are being made, is imperative. Indigenous peoples hold a wealth of knowledge that will be beneficial to all nations in the face of a changing climate. I'm hopeful that if we all start thinking of human rights as being the rights of all beings, as expressed under the Creator's law, strive to live by the 7 grandfather teachings, and make our decisions based on the 7 generations principle, that the impacts of climate change won't be so devastating and minimum will be achievable. Miigwech. Oh, you're muted, Anna.
I'm really sorry about that. Thank you very much, Sarah and Carrie Ann, for your wonderful presentations. It was very eye-opening. And we have a little time for some questions and a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask, or please write it into the chat box, and and the panelists will address the questions. And if we don't have time, we can also forward the questions to the panelists later on, email them. Thank you so much for everyone who did put their information in at the beginning of where you're from and where you're working from. So it looks like, just a brief summary, we have a lot of participants who work in health or public health, and also perhaps urban planning, and ranging from Ontario to Alberta, Manitoba, and British Columbia. Just to, and we also have a visitor, an attendant from India as well. Welcome. Just to give a little bit of a synopsis there. Yeah, does anybody have any questions? If you guys are still thinking about questions, I do have one question for you, either Carrie Ann or Sarah. Yeah, you mentioned, you talked a bit about the traditional ecological knowledge lens of looking at, say, vector-borne diseases versus from the view of Western science. Could you please expand on, maybe contrast on how Western science would look at the issue? You had mentioned that sort of looking at the plants and the environments in a more holistic way can address vector-borne diseases, but could you please also contrast the traditional Western science way? Thanks.
So I think I did explain that a little bit in the presentation in terms of the differences of Western science and traditional knowledge. So traditional knowledge is very place specific. So it's those stories and observations about the environment over a long period of time, where Western science is very focused and very, a lot of the observations are in a very short period of time with a lot of hypothesis and trying to work around those hypotheses, where the knowledge of the Indigenous peoples are actually coming from those observations that have been had and passed down from generation to generation over time. And I think that's a really important piece that, you know, I would really like to be able to get across in terms of colonization, where that disconnect between the Indigenous people and the land, and more importantly, that disconnection between that intergenerational knowledge translation has really, I think, impacted the knowledge that we have now and the rate in which we can share our knowledge to inform climate adaptation planning moving forward. We're right now sort of what we're calling repicking up our bundles and really trying to seek out our knowledge holders that hold that knowledge that has not been translated from generation to generation, so that we can ensure that that knowledge is being embedded into the plans moving forward.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you for the expanding on that. That's so interesting. Does anybody else have any other questions or have? Okay, we have one question here for both of you. Thank you so much for your presentations. Can you talk to the One Health approach and its potential to incorporate TK? Is anything missing from the One Health approach?
So I can take a stab at this. I am by no means an expert in the theory of One Health, but I do have some understanding of it, and we apply it as well. I think One Health is much more holistic than other methods to address this topic area, because it does consider both human health, animal health, and environmental health, and tries to work together. I wouldn't be able to speak to any specific gaps, but I would say it's probably in the right direction.
Great, thank you.
So yeah, I don't think I can really add too much on that. I'm not very familiar with the One Health approach, but to me, it sounds like Sarah said, it is in the right direction and along those lines of how the Indigenous perspective takes things into context, right? It's that we're looking at that holistic view. Again, with Western science, a lot of the times what happens is very focused and doesn't take into consideration those outside factors that could influence the outcomes, where that holistic approach that the Indigenous people take is exactly that. We look at the environment as a whole rather than just a narrow thinking.
Right, thank you for that, Sarah and Carrie Ann. I guess my understanding of One Health is sort of looking at both human and animal health together, right? And the connection between the two. So I would imagine that TK would incorporate a lot of looking at the whole ecosystem and not just human health, and considering all the, the animals as well. Yeah.
I think it also takes into account different sector perspectives and expertise, which is
right.
what we need to do to be able to adapt to climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. We need that intersectoral collaboration and different expertise. And so One Health does have that, and that's a little bit of the Twoeyed Seeing as well, bringing these two different perspectives together, and how can they complement and build and strengthen each other for a stronger outcome.
That's a good point. Thanks.
And I'll just add to that, that again, in the Indigenous perspective, and again, our principles and philosophies are pretty simple and straightforward, is we have to remember that what we do to the earth and the environment we're actually doing to ourselves. So we might not see that now, and that's that 7th-generation thinking, is that what we do today, we don't want those impacts to be felt 7 generations from now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a good point of view. We have another question posed. Do you have any specific, can you give a case example on how Indigenous knowledge can solve or help in climate change adaptation? For example, vector-borne diseases, and I think you did talk about that a bit. I don't know if you would like to expand on that example or have another example maybe?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that we're learning is, again, right, it's so important, I think, in any aspect to understand the histories in regards to how it brought us to where we are today, and the issues that we're dealing with and trying to solve. Because if we don't know those histories, we could be coming up with solutions that have proven to not work already for our future. So as part of that, those are those observations, and in our culture, the animals, the environment itself is our teachers. So being able to have that knowledge transferred from generation to generation helps us in preparing for and understanding what is coming. So observing the animals, for instance, and I'll give you an example, and this is an example that I used in the paper that Sarah and I have collaborated on, is that a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, told this story out in Manitoba around being on the land and being a hunter and a trapper, and coming across a beaver dam in the fall that the beaver was working away on, and it was huge, he said, and that following spring there was one of the major floods in Manitoba, and they never thought anything about it. But then a couple of years later, again out in the field, out trapping, hunting, and observing the landscape, and they came across another beaver dam in the fall, and the beaver was working hard to build this beaver dam, and that very next spring again was major flooding. So it's things like that traditional ecological knowledge forecasts for us in being able to help us as human beings prepare for what's coming. And those are the observations and the knowledge of that history that is so important for that generational translation from generation to generation, so that it helps us understand what the animals are doing, what the environment itself is doing, and being observant of that to help us use those same elements within our environment to prepare for climate change. Another example, and again, I mentioned this a little bit, the vector-borne diseases, Lyme disease, for instance, sweetgrass, we've been told by our elders, is a natural deterrent for ticks. And our communities used to be prevalent, abundant of sweetgrass. And again, it's those teachings of that and that disconnect from generation to generation, where those medicines were used often, and because of genocide and assimilation and colonization, those practices aren't being upheld, and those medicines have started to disappear. So we're actually now starting to regenerate those kind of medicines within our communities because of that knowledge that we know about stuff like vector-borne diseases.
That's great, thank you.
I could add something from my experience. So I am not Indigenous, I am of settler ancestry. And in my journey to learn about traditional ecological knowledge, what I think it has done for me is to better understand Canada's historic colonialism, and understand how certain policies have impacted Indigenous cultures and different perspectives that you can't learn from reading in a regular textbook. So it gives me a deeper understanding of our history, how Indigenous people may have been impacted by certain policies, continue to be impacted today. And then also it has increased my appreciation for my environment, or the environment that I am on and take up. So although I am not able to potentially, or don't have experience or training in understanding traditional ecological knowledge, the understanding of what it is and how it can be applied, I think has been really meaningful to me personally and as a public health professional.
Oh, great. Thank you, Sarah. That's great. And we have maybe time for one more question. Thank you both for the wonderful talk. Can you expand on the role of Indigenous people's knowledge in conserving the biodiversity in Canada?
So yeah, so it's very well known that within Indigenous communities, I think where we hold about 80% of the intact biological diversity. And that's the importance of that relationship where Indigenous people have that kinship with the land. So the land is not looked at as a commodity, but actually as a community and a very important piece of our existence and survival. So that's really, I think, where we lead. We've been gifted the knowledge to understand the environment and be able to, I guess, communicate with the environment. And that is part of our role and responsibility as Indigenous peoples, is to help others understand that interconnectedness and help them realize the importance of holding the environment and the beings within it as family rather than as commodity. So that's, I think, where we really lead. And we know, because of our histories, and that's so important of knowing our histories, we've not been able to uphold our responsibilities to this point.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. Would you guys mind we have one hand raised for one more question. Ronald, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, everybody. Yes, I have a two-part question, and some of it may have already been answered, but I see two aspects here. One is how does the interaction between Indigenous peoples and public health authorities help public health undertake climate change adaptation within their jurisdiction? And the other aspect would be, how can public health assist First Nation communities in their own adaptation plans? Any suggestions?
So I think I'll answer the second part first. And it's something that, it's in my title. I am the Environment Partnership Coordinator. So I am in a position, and I've really, I think, held myself to the responsibility in being privileged in the work that I get to do, to ensure that our communities are aware of the partnerships that are out there, that and the want for people to partner with our communities in a good, meaningful way. So yeah, the communities are reaching out. And I think that's a big part of it as well, is that the communities don't have capacity or the resources. And often when people reach in, because of that capacity and resource that they don't have, those relationships are often not being formed. But as the communities start to be aware of the good intentions of people such as the public health units, they are starting to reach out to those organizations with the help of organizations like ours, who is, you know, Indigenous owned and operated and uniquely all Indigenous staffed. So we already understand those needs and can help build those relationships. So in terms of the public health in helping provide those spaces, it's not just about providing spaces, but again, I'm going to really reiterate the importance of providing meaningful spaces. And meaningful spaces is not just a space at a table, but also that ethical space at that table where the Indigenous voices are being heard on an equal level and incorporated into the plans that are being developed moving forward. I hope I answered that.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have time for today. Just posted an evaluation link in the chat box. If you could please fill that out when you get a chance. Just wanted to also thank Sarah and Carrie Ann again for giving us such a wonderful presentation. And if you guys have any more questions, please email them and we will forward them to Sarah and Carrie Ann and yeah, to coordinate some answers. Let's see, and yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you guys have a great week.